Ek is 'n Afrikaner. My verhaal is die verhaal van 'n nuwe volk met 'n nuwe taal op nuwe bodem ontstaan.
The majority of the whites were descendants of Europeans who'd settled in southern Africa 300 years before. The Afrikaners had their own language, their own political party, and their own church, which taught that white superiority and rule over blacks was the will of God. Nico Smith was a theology student and a true believer.
They were the inferior people. They were the strange people. They had a different culture. And I also, to a certain extent, believed that they were the cursed people, of whom the Bible says that they were the descendants of Ham, and they were cursed. And so they must be the laborers. And I couldn't imagine that one should ever really associate with them or even touch them.
When the Afrikaner National Party won power in the 1948 election, they gave discrimination the force of law. The all-white parliament passed a series of measures that extended segregation, institutionalizing white supremacy into a system that became known as Apartheid. South Africa was now moving beyond simple segregation to completely separate development. The guiding genius was Hendrik Verwoerd.
Our policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily and perhaps much better be described as a policy of good neighborliness. Accepting that there are differences between people. But while these differences exist, and you have to acknowledge them, at the same time, you can live together, aid one another, but that it can best be done when you act as good neighbors always do.
In meticulous detail, the South African government devised a new racial map in which good neighbors would have as little to do with each other as possible. From the 1960s, the entire black population was allocated to one of 8 so-called tribal homelands. Each was to have its own citizenship and, eventually, its own independence. The homelands covered 13% of South Africa. The remaining 87% was for the whites. To complete the grand design, over 3.5 million South Africans were forcibly relocated. Bongeni Ndlovu was deported from Johannesburg to the KwaZulu homeland in Natal.
I can't say how we were meant to survive under the apartheid laws. My family lived a miserable life. My wife would often have to go to neighbors' houses to ask for food, and then I wouldn't eat, because otherwise there wouldn't be enough for the children.
The homelands were used as a vast labor recruitment camp for white South African employers.
What has he got to offer? He's got his labor to offer. If he doesn't work for the European, then obviously he will die of famine in the reserve.
But it wasn't easy to get off the reserves. Africans had to have an official job permit to go and work in white areas. And those who did were billeted in overcrowded and primitive township hostels, treated as outsiders, foreigners in their own land. The conditions black Africans were living under began to disturb even some of the government's own supporters, including Nico Smith. So much so that he left the National Party and began to speak out in opposition.
For instance, in the black township, I was shocked because there was nothing. There were no cinemas, no proper shops, no cafes, no playgrounds for children, no recreational opportunities. And every night I saw these thousands of black people streaming into the township, and in the morning they stream out again. So it was actually only a slave camp, you can call it.
On the bus for a little while, and I saw the mob begin to just build, just like a kind of a river, you know, just growing.
You could see things in their hands, hammers, chains, pipes.
It was a frenzy. They just went, wow.
I'd get the nigger lover. I mean, I was the only white guy there.
They were screaming and hollering, and their faces were all frowned up until they grabbed Jim's work. And they took him and they knocked him over the rail. And they picked him up and they knocked him over the rail again. They knocked his teeth out.
I remember getting kicked in the spine and hearing my back crack and the pain. And I passed out again, and I woke up, and I was again in a moving vehicle with some very southern-sounding whites, and I figured I'm off to get lynched.
We're dedicated to this. We'll take hitting, we'll take beating. We're willing to accept death. Segregation must be broken down.
You're under arrest. And we're marching on.
As the sit-ins and arrests continued, the civil rights movement gripped America. By 1963, over 36,000 people had been sent to jail for protesting segregation laws.